They came to seize a repair yard. They brought 34 warships and one clerk with a stamp. They went home in hulls the humans built for them, at cost, with the invoices attached. The Corin Gap is not a place anyone would choose to live. It is a lane of clean space about 6 hours wide, running between two slow fields of tumbling rock, and it is the only route between the inner shipping lanes and the outer worlds that does not add 3 weeks to a voyage. Everything that moves in that part of the sector moves through the gap. Ore, grain, medicine, troops, mail. It is a hallway. Somebody built a station in the middle of it a long time ago, and the station is called Senate Reach. Senate Reach is a wheel of gray plate with 16 docking arms and a smell that never fully leaves clothing. The lighting in the outer ring is bad and has been bad for decades. There is a stain on the deck outside the arbitration room that predates the current administration and probably the one before it. The coffee in the concourse machine is not coffee. Nobody who works there calls it coffee. They call it the brown, and they drink it anyway because the shifts are long. On Dock 6 there is a yard called Vask Fitting and Salvage, 2 pressure bays, 1 gantry with a bad lift motor, 4 employees, and a debt of 62,000 credits to the station authority that Neri Vask had been paying down at the rate of a small tragedy per month for 6 years. On the first day, Neri Vask read the compliance order on a screen with a dead pixel in the upper left corner. She had been looking at that dead pixel for so long that she no longer saw it except when the screen went white. And the compliance order was formatted on a white field, so she saw it. The order was 4 pages. She read the first page twice. The Draik ascendancy, acting under its standing authority over the shipping lanes, would extend administration to the human polity and its associated works, effective on the 30th day. A compliance force would arrive at Senate Reach on the 30th day to take custody of dock infrastructure, repair capacity, and personnel records. Cooperation was expected. Cooperation was, in fact, assumed because the human polity appeared in the ascendancy registry under provisioning and hull services, and nothing in that schedule had ever required a fleet. Neri Vask was 42 years old, and she was a Draik herself, which is worth saying now because it explains what happened later. She was not from the part of the ascendancy that gave orders. She was from the part that fixed things after the orders were carried out. She read the 4th page, which listed the categories of personnel to be recorded, and she found the category that covered most of her staff: Hull Service Auxiliary, non-technical. She sat with that for a while. Then she walked down to Bay 2, where a 75-year-old human was lying on his back on a creeper under 306 meters of dead ship, doing something to a valve with a tool he had made himself. His name was Gus Meade. She had hired him 8 years earlier at the labor exchange on the 2nd concourse, on a Tuesday, in the rain that the station's water reclamation system produced on the 2nd concourse every Tuesday and had never been repaired. Human labor came out of the hull service drawer. Hull service rates were 15 credits a day. A certified fitter in the ascendancy schedule drew 80. She had needed a certified fitter and could afford a hull service auxiliary, and she had told herself, standing in that fake rain, that the difference was the station's fault and not hers. It was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. She had asked him one question at the exchange. She had asked what he had done before. Fitting, he had said. That was the whole answer. It was true, and it was the least true thing anybody said on Senate Reach that year. 800 light years away, in a room with better lighting and worse air, Marshal Ted Carr was being shown a chart. The chart was of the compliance force: 4 heavy cruisers, 12 escorts, 18 auxiliaries, 34 hulls, 6,920 crew. Carr had run 7 compliance actions in his career, and not one of them had been contested, which was not because he was frightening. It was because the ascendancy did not schedule contests. It scheduled arrivals. A staff officer read out the estimated duration: 12 days from arrival to handover. Carr asked whether the human polity maintained armed vessels. The staff officer said the registry showed none. Carr asked how old the registry entry was. There was a pause of the kind that happens when nobody has checked and everybody assumes somebody did. 280 years, the officer said. Carr nodded. He had a habit of standing at the observation port during briefings, and he did it then, looking out at the yard traffic, small tugs moving in the ordinary way, and he found that it looked exactly as it always had. That was the part he would think about later, not the fleet, the tugs. What nobody in that room knew, and what the file had never been asked to say, was how the entry had been made in the first place. 280 years earlier, the first human vessel any ascendancy officer had ever laid eyes on was a supply tender with a bent mast and a full hold. And the officer who logged it had filed it the way a reasonable person files a thing that arrives carrying groceries. Provisioning, hull services, a logistics client. Nobody had ever resurveyed it because nobody resurveys a settled category. It is not a lie. It is worse than a lie. A lie can be caught. A category just sits in the drawer and keeps being consulted. On the first day, at the end of the shift, Gus Meade slid out from under the hulk, wiped his hands on a rag that had stopped helping years ago, and looked at the order on Neri's tablet. He read the whole thing. Then he read the second page again, the one with the arrival date. Neri asked him what he thought. He said the date was the interesting part. She asked what that meant. He said 30 days was not a lot of time to move 6,000 people across 2 rock fields, and that whoever wrote it had never had to buy the fuel. Then he went to wash up. Marshal Ted Carr signed the movement order at the end of his own shift, in a room where the recycler hummed on a note a half-step flat. He did not hesitate. There was nothing in front of him that suggested hesitation. He wrote the 2 words that the ascendancy had been writing for 3 centuries at the bottom of orders exactly like this one. The 2 words are worth holding back for a moment because of what was happening in other rooms while the pen was moving. A compliance order is a form. It has been the same form for 300 years, and the ascendancy is proud of that, the way institutions are proud of anything that saves them from thinking. There is a box at the top for the polity. There is a box for the schedule the polity sits in. There is a box for estimated duration, a box for handover authority, and at the bottom, a short line where the signing officer may indicate intent. Most officers leave that line blank because nothing requires it. Carr never did. He had a theory that a man who could not be bothered to write 2 words could not be bothered to read the annexes either. On Dock 6, at roughly the same hour, Neri Vask was doing the accounts. She did them on the 1st of every month at a desk with a drawer that opened only if lifted, and she did them on paper first and the terminal second, because she did not trust a machine to tell her something she did not already know. The station authority loan had started at 106,000 credits. It stood at 62,000. She paid $840 a month against it and had done for 6 years, and the interest ate a third of that. And she had long ago stopped calculating the finish date because the number made her angry rather than motivated. Beside the ledger sat a supplier quote for a replacement lift motor for the gantry in Bay 1. She had been carrying that quote for 2 years. Every month she looked at it, and every month she put it back in the drawer that only opened if lifted. Kip Dorr came in without knocking, which was allowed, and put a cup of the brown on the corner of the desk, which was expected. He was the apprentice, and he was Draik, and he had grown up aboard an ascendancy escort because his mother cooked on one, which meant he was the only person on that dock who knew what the inside of a compliance force smelled like. Behind him came Ona Bex, the welder, still in her leathers, carrying her hood by the strap. Ona was human. So was the night hand, who worked 2 shifts a week and slept through most of one of them. That was the yard. 4 people, 2 pressure bays, 1 gantry with a bad motor. Kip asked whether they were going to lose the place. Neri said no. He asked how she knew. She said the order took custody of dock infrastructure, repair capacity, and personnel records, and that ownership was not on the list. Onabex asked what personnel records meant. Neri Vask did not answer right away. She had read the fourth page twice, and she knew exactly what it meant. And she also knew that saying it out loud in her own office at the end of a shift would make it real in a way she was not ready for. "It means they write down what everybody is," she said. Onabex put her hood on the shelf by the door. She said she had been written down before. Then she went home. 3 levels up, in a single-berth quarters on the inner ring, Gus Meade ate the same dinner he ate 4 nights out of 7 and washed the plate immediately because he was of a generation that regarded a plate in a sink as an unfinished job. Then he sat down in the chair by the port. He went through his pockets the way he did every night and set the contents on the arm of the chair. A stub of chalk, a folding rule, a short length of safety wire, bent double, and one more thing, small and round in cast, which he turned over once in his fingers and then put into the drawer beside the chair without looking at it, the way a man handles an object he stopped needing to look at decades ago. He shut the drawer. The narrator will not say yet what was in it. Outside the port there was ordinary traffic, small tugs moving the way tugs move, which is slowly and with their lights on the wrong things. It is worth describing what a compliance action actually is, because the words suggest force, and the reality is closer to paperwork with an escort. The ascendancy had been extending administration this way for 3 centuries, and had refined it into something almost gentle. A polity is surveyed. The survey assigns a schedule. The schedule sets the terms. Then, at a moment of the ascendancy's choosing, a force arrives. A custody officer disembarks with a case, and the local infrastructure changes hands over the course of about 12 days, after which tariffs are collected and everyone goes back to work under a different letterhead. There is almost never any shooting. There is almost never any need. The whole method rests on a single quiet assumption, which is that the survey was correct, and the reason nobody examines that assumption is that it usually is. The handover kit for a compliance action is standardized and comes in a gray case. It contains the forms, a seal, a stamp with a date wheel, a folded flag that nobody ever raises, and a set of category codes printed on stiff card so the custody officer does not have to guess. The custody officer assigned to Senate Reach was a small, precise man named Led. He was told on the first day, along with his travel authority, and he spent that evening checking the date wheel on his stamp against the station calendar, because he had once been embarrassed at a handover by a stamp that was a day behind. He would be the first ascendancy official to set foot in Vask Fitting and Salvage. His form would have a box for vessels under construction and a box for vessels in service, and no box at all for the thing standing in Bay 2. Elsewhere in the fleet, in a compartment 2 decks below the flag bridge, Sub-Marshal Hesk was reading the provisioning annex, which is the part of a movement order that nobody reads. He read it because he was the kind of officer who assumes the boring document is where the trouble lives. The annex covered fuel, water, consumables, and spares for 34 hulls across a transit of 22 days. And it was competent, and it balanced, and it had one line in it that made him stop. Resupply in transit and at destination was listed as local procurement. Hesk took it up the next morning, standing at the rail behind Carr's chair, in the professionally survivable phrasing that people in his position learn early. "Marshal," he said, "local procurement means their depots." Carr said it did. Hesk said that seems circular given the purpose of the deployment. Carr said it was standard, that every compliance action in living memory had been provisioned the same way, and that a polity being taken into administration has no reason to interrupt a service it will shortly be paid for. That answer was correct in every previous case. It was correct in this one too, as far as it went, which is the difficulty with correct answers. Hesk said, "Thank you, Marshal," and went back down 2 decks and read the annex again, and made a private note of the line, and did not raise it a second time. He would raise it a second time on the 23rd day, in a different tone, and by then it would already be too late to matter. On the first day, the Human Depot Consortium knew nothing about any of this. That is the part that gets lost afterward, when people describe what happened as a plan. There was no plan on the first day. There were 8 depots running routine schedules, 208 tenders on ordinary contracts, and 3,800 certified fitters doing what fitters do, which is drive somewhere, test something, sign a card, and drive somewhere else. Ellie Ward was on Bracken Station arguing with a supplier about hose. The compliance order had been published on the Ascendancy Registry in the Ascendancy language, in a section that human carriers had no reason to read, and it would be 4 days before a shipping agent on the outer worlds noticed it, and 11 more before anyone did anything with the information. The most dangerous thing an institution can do is announce a decision in a place where the affected party does not look. It feels like transparency from the inside. From the outside, it is indistinguishable from surprise. Back in the cabin with the recycler humming a half-step flat, Marshal Ted Carr finished the annex list, initialed the crew return, and came to the short line at the bottom of the form. He was 58 years old. He had a photograph of a house clipped inside the cover of his order folder, and the house had a bad roof, and he had been meaning to deal with the roof for 4 years. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid one. And if anyone had walked into that cabin and told him that the file was wrong, he would have asked to see the correction and read it and taken it seriously. Nobody walked in. The correction was 2 days away from being written by an auditor on OSIT who had not yet pulled the entry, and it would be approved, and it would never arrive. Carr uncapped the pen. He had signed this line at the bottom of 7 previous orders, and none of those 7 had gone wrong. And there is no lesson available to a man from an unbroken record except the wrong one. He wrote the 2 words the way he always wrote them, small, in the corner, with no underline and no flourish, because a flourish suggests doubt. Proceed as scheduled. 2 days later, in a records vault on the prefecture world of Osat, an auditor named Ril Vane pulled the human entry to check a shipping tariff and found that it had never been amended. Not once. Not in 280 years. She sat down on a stool that was too low for the desk, which is how everyone in that vault sat, and she read it 3 times. Then she read it again. The entry was 104 words long, and it described a single ship. It said the vessel was of light construction, that it carried foodstuffs and machine parts, that its master was cooperative, and that the species appeared to be organized principally around the movement and repair of goods. From that one encounter, on one day, an entire people had been assigned a shelf. Ril Vane was not a dramatic person. She had spent her whole working life in rooms where the most exciting thing that happened was a corrected decimal. But she understood filing the way a surgeon understands blood. And she knew what she was looking at. And what she was looking at was not an out-of-date number. It was a category mistake. Somebody had put a people in the wrong kind of drawer and then locked the cabinet. She wrote the request that night. It was short because she had learned that long requests get read by nobody. It asked for authority to conduct a physical resurvey of the human polity and its industrial capacity, and it gave 3 grounds. The entry rested on a single observation. The observation was of a supply vessel. Supply vessels are what a people sends where a people expects no trouble. She filed it on the 2nd day. She heard nothing for 4 days, which in the registry service is fast. On the 6th day, she was summoned to a review board, which is where warnings go on OSAT, and the room had 6 chairs and 5 people and a jug of water with no cups. Presiding was a deputy of Sector Prefect Osun, a careful man named Beck, who had never in his life said no to anything and had never in his life said yes either. Ril Vane made her case in under 4 minutes. She put up the original entry. She put up the tonnage figures for human registered carriers moving through the Coran Gap in the last decade, which were not small. She put up the coupling registry, and this was the part she had spent 2 nights on. Because the coupling registry is boring, and she needed it not to be. Every fuel transfer in the sector, she said, runs through a collar. A collar is the fitting that joins two ships so one can pump into the other without either of them coming apart. There are, in theory, several patterns. In practice, there is one. It is called the M pattern. It was published without patent 43 years ago, and it is used by every yard between here and the outer worlds because it is free and because it works. She let that sit. Then she said the sentence that would be quoted back in a different room by a different person on a worse day. The schedule describes how we met them, she said. It does not describe what they are. Beck thanked her. He said the board found the argument serious. He said the request was approved. Then he read the conditions. The resurvey would require countersignature from the prefects of Koran, Osat, and Draik in person, in that order, as physical inspection authorities. The survey would need to be completed and lodged before the effective date of the compliance action, which was the 30th day. It was, at that moment, the 6th day. Rilvain did the arithmetic in her head while she was still standing up, because she was an auditor, and that is what auditors do with a number. The shortest circuit touching all three prefecture seats, allowing for the transit windows, was 46 days. She had 24. She said so, out loud, politely. Beck said the conditions were the conditions, and that she was of course free to attempt them. He was not being cruel either. He was being a deputy. This is the thing about institutions that never makes it into the histories. They rarely refuse. Refusal creates a record, and a record creates a responsibility. What they do instead is agree, warmly, and then attach a requirement that cannot be satisfied, and then file the agreement, and then everyone involved can say afterward that permission was granted. The permission was real. The door was real. The door was 2 rooms further down a corridor that ended in 22 days of wall. Rilvain went back to the vault. She did not attempt the circuit because she could add. Instead, she did the only thing available to a person who has been approved into paralysis. She wrote a note and entered it into the record beneath the original survey, where it would be seen by anyone who pulled the file for any reason at all. 14 lines. The last one repeated what she had said to the board. Then she went home, ate something she did not taste, and lay awake doing the circuit again in case she had made an error. She had not. She never had. 8 days after the order was published, the compliance force left the assembly point at Koran. It is worth describing because it was genuinely impressive, and because impressive is the whole reason nobody checked. 4 heavy cruisers in line, each one 9 city blocks of layered plate, 12 escorts spread wide, 18 auxiliaries strung out behind like the tail of something, 6,920 people, most of them under 30, most of them told that this would be a 12-day administrative deployment with shore rotation at a station that had a swimming pool. Senate Reach does not have a swimming pool. It has a tank that used to be one. The transit was 22 days. On the 12th day, at Depot 4, a human supply station clamped to a rock at the mouth of the gap, the fleet's advance requisition list went up on the public board, because that is where requisitions go. Every depot in the sector posts them. It is not a secret. It is a shopping list. Gus Meade saw the same list on Senate Reach at the end of his shift, standing at the concourse board with a cup of the brown going cold in his hand. He read it 3 times. Then he read it again. He was not reading the tonnages. He was reading the fittings column. Then he went and found Neri Vask in the office and asked her, quietly, whether she had ever pulled a collar off an ascendancy escort. She said no. He said he had, once, years ago, on a Hulk. He said the ascendancy did not make collars. He said the ascendancy bought them. She asked from where. He said from everyone, because they were free. 2 days later, in a room on Bracken Station with a table too big for it, the Human Depot Consortium convened. There were 14 people around the table, and 8 of them were tired. The chair was a woman named Ellie Ward, 62, who had run depots for 35 years and who kept a mechanical pencil in her shirt pocket because the electronic ones died in cold holds. She opened by asking for the honest number. A logistics officer named Dev Cho gave it to her. Of the 34 hulls in the compliance force, 30 ran M-pattern transfer collars, not compatible with. Ran. It was their transfer system. The 4 that did not were the heavy cruisers, which used a proprietary bulk fitting for reactor feed, and which drew their day-to-day consumables through auxiliaries that ran M-pattern. The room was quiet for a moment. Somebody asked whether that meant what it sounded like it meant. Ellie Ward said it meant the fleet coming to take custody of them could not feed itself for a month without fittings certified by people it was coming to take custody of. Then she said the other half, because she was the kind of chair who says both halves. It also means, she said, that if a collar fails on their side, people die on their side, and we are the only ones out here who know how to stop that. Somebody said the obvious thing. Somebody always does. He said they should stop certifying. Ellie Ward let it sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said no, and she said it flatly, without heat. She said the consortium would certify everything that could honestly be certified, refuse nothing that could honestly be issued, test every single fit, and sign every single card. She said the standard was the standard whether they liked who was standing at the other end of the hose or not. And then she said the thing they would repeat to each other for the next month. Not yet. On the 16th day, at Depot 4, a fuel line hand named Tam Ochoa was handed a stack of transfer certificates by an ascendancy liaison officer who had come ahead of the fleet and who was pleasant about it. The certificates covered 48 collars on 6 auxiliaries. The liaison explained that time was short and asked him to sign them now so the transfer could begin on arrival. Tam Ochoa was 26. He had a bad shoulder from a hose whip 4 years earlier and a photograph of a dog taped inside his locker door. He looked at the stack. He looked at the last certification dates on the collars, which were 340 days old, and the standard, which is 60. He set the pen down on the counter. He did not make a speech. He said he could not certify a fit he had not tested. The liaison said it was a formality. Tam Ochoa said then it would not take long to do properly. Then he picked up his tools and went to test the first one. And he tested it the way it is supposed to be tested, which takes 50 minutes per collar. And when it passed, he signed that card and only that card. He would be offered, later, in a much larger room, the chance to explain himself on the record. Remember that. On the 17th day, the escort Vel attempted an underway transfer using an uncertified collar, because they were behind schedule and the collar let go at pressure. The report said structural failure of a transfer component, cause under review. It did not say what a collar does when it lets go at pressure, which is come off the flange like a thrown ring and take the compartment with it. 6 people died. 6. That is a small number in a fleet of 6,920, and it was treated as one, and the transit continued on schedule. On the 18th day back at Senate Reach, Neri Vask went into Bay 2 looking for Gus and found him on the gantry with a wire brush, working at a patch of the Hulk's flank about the size of a door. She asked what he was doing. He said cleaning. She climbed up. Under 43 years of paint and grime and 3 separate resprays, there was a builder's plate. Cast, not printed. She read it twice. Hull 1, ardent. Then the yard of record, which was not a yard at all, but a list of 14 shops on 3 moons, cast into the metal in letters 2 centimeters high, because whoever ordered the plate had refused to leave any of them off. And at the bottom, in the space where the constructor signs, one name, G. Meade. Neri Vask stood on a gantry with a bad lift motor and looked at a piece of metal and did the only arithmetic available to her. 43 years. He was 75. He had been 32. She said his name. He kept brushing. She said, "That is a warship." He said it had been. She said the registry has this hull down as a bulk tender, conversion pending, and she had the paperwork in the office because she had bought it for scrap weight 11 years ago from a broker who could not get rid of it. He said that was right. She asked why. He said because when they finished it, there was no category for what it was. And the clerk asked what it carried, and somebody said fuel and spares, and the clerk wrote tender, and by the time anyone noticed, the war it was built for had ended. He came down off the gantry then, slowly, because his knees were 75 years old, and he told her the rest, sitting on an upturned crate, in one go, because she needed it to make a decision. 43 years ago, the human worlds had 8 weeks warning and no navy and no shipyard capable of building anything larger than a freighter. Everyone said it took 4 years to build a warship. Everyone was right. If you build a warship the way a warship is built, which is one hull, in one yard, by craftsmen from the keel up. He had been a 32-year-old fitting foreman with no standing and one idea. And the idea was not clever. It was clerical. Stop building a ship. Build a parts list. Break the hull into sections small enough that a shop that made grain silos could make one. Publish the fittings so every shop makes the same joint. Number everything. Then assemble. 14 shops on 3 moons. 105 days from first plate to power on. The Ardent was ugly, she was slow. Her welds were visible from 3 kilometers, and she was there, which was the entire point, and the reason the war ended in a negotiation instead of a landing. He said all this in the tone of a man describing a job. Then he said the only line he ever said twice about it. Parts, not miracles. Neri asked him what he had done afterward. He said he had gone back to fitting. She asked why the collar standard was free. He said because the whole method dies if the parts do not interchange, and parts do not interchange if somebody owns the drawing. He said he had put the M pattern in the public registry the same week and never thought about it again, and that as far as he knew, a few yards had picked it up. A few yards had picked it up. She asked him what they should do, and Gus Mead, 75 years old, 15 credits a day, said the thing that was going to define the next 26 days. He said, if they ask for help, we help. That is the whole plan. She said that was not a plan. He said it was the only one that worked in both directions. And then he went to find the drain plug for the Ardent's port ballast tank, which he had been looking for since the previous winter. On the 23rd day, the transfer queue on the compliance force had gone from a routine 4 hours per auxiliary to 19. Nothing had been refused. That was the part nobody in the ascendancy could get their hands around. Every request was accepted. Every fitter who could be spared was sent. Every card was signed the moment the fit passed. And the whole enormous machine had slowed to the speed of one man with a pressure gauge doing a 50-minute test, times 48 collars, times 6 auxiliaries, times 30 hulls. Compliance is a wonderful thing when it is done exactly. On the 23rd day also, the escort Dunmar attempted a hot transfer to save 4 hours with a collar whose card had not come back. 26 people died. The count of hulls unable to conduct independent transfer went from 5 to 13. Marshal Ted Carr sent a signal to Prefect Osen requesting authority to requisition non-standard fittings from ascendancy yards and bypass the human certification chain entirely. The reply came back in under a day, which was flattering. Authority granted, provided the substitute fittings carried valid sector certification. Sector certification of a new fitting pattern takes 60 days. The fleet had 16 days of consumables. Carr read it in his day cabin with a cup of something cooling beside him and a fan that rattled at one particular angle. He did not throw it. He did not swear. He put it face down on the desk and sat for 4 minutes. It is worth saying clearly what had happened to him, because it happens constantly and almost never gets named. He had not been denied. He had been approved. approved into a corridor with a wall at the end of it, by a man in an office who would be able to say, truthfully, for the rest of his life, that he had granted every request the marshal made. His flag captain, a quiet officer named Sub-Marshal Hesk, came in with the transfer figures and stood there while Carr read them. Then Hesk asked the question. He asked it the way careful seconds ask things, with the rank in front of it so it could be a request for information instead of an accusation. "Marshal," he said, "who makes our collars?" Carr said the yards. Hesk said which yards. Carr did not answer right away. On the 25th day, in a compartment on Bracken Station at 3 in the morning, 4 people were standing in front of a board with a problem on it that would not move. The room had a bad ceiling light that buzzed at a frequency you could feel in a filling. 2 of them were consortium fitters. One was Gus Meade on a relay screen from Senate Reach with a blanket over his shoulders. One was a 20-year-old Draik apprentice named Kip Dorr, who worked for Neri Vask, who had been brought in because he was the only person present who had ever been aboard an Ascendancy escort, having grown up on one, his mother being a cook. The wall was this. The fleet needed thousands of certified collar fits in the next 2 weeks. A collar fit takes 50 minutes to test. There were 3,800 certified fitters in the entire sector, and most of them had jobs. The arithmetic did not close. It was not close to closing. They had been at it for 6 hours and had gotten as far as arguing about whether the test could be shortened, which it could not because the test is the thing. At 3 in the morning, Kip Dorr walked up to the board and said the group had been thinking about it wrong. He said they kept trying to certify collars. He said a collar is not what fails. A joint is what fails. Certify the joint, at the moment of use, 1 transfer at a time, with a card per transfer instead of a card per part. He said it was slower per ship and faster per fleet because it removed the backlog entirely and turned it into a queue that moved. There was a long pause on the relay. Then Gus Meade said, from under his blanket, that the boy was right, and that it was the same trick as the sections, which is that you do not make the job smaller, you make it divisible. Then he said something else that Kip Dorr remembered for the rest of his life. He said the only reason he had ever solved anything was that he had never been clever enough to attack a thing head-on. Kip Dorr would sign his own cards one day. The first one he signed alone would be for a water pump. What happened next happened in the dark, in the way that logistics always happens in the dark, which is why nobody writes about it. Ellie Ward authorized a pre-positioning order to all 8 depots. 208 tenders were moved out of routine service and staged along the fleet's transit corridor, loaded with collars, seals, hose, water, and fitters. It was not a trap, and it was not a blockade. It was a service posture. The consortium had a standing obligation to render assistance to any vessel in distress in the gap, an obligation it had honored for 4 decades, most recently for an Ascendancy grain hauler that had lost attitude control and been towed in free of charge. Ellie Ward simply looked at 30 hulls running lapsed collars into a rock field and made a professional judgment about where help was going to be needed. She was asked, at the table, whether they should tell the Ascendancy the tenders were coming. She said not yet. On the 28th day, an Ascendancy patrol escort rounding the outer marker of the gap found a human tender already there. Not approaching, stationary, station keeping on the marker, running deck lights, holding a full pallet of M-pattern collars and 2 fitters in suits playing cards on the cargo ramp. The patrol commander hailed and asked its business. The tendermaster said he was standing by. The commander asked, standing by for what? The master said for whatever they needed. The commander asked how long the tender had been there. The master said 6 days. The patrol commander filed a contact report that afternoon. He described the vessel, the cargo, and the crew, and then he wrote a final line that his own staff removed before it went up the chain, because it was not the kind of thing that goes in a report. He wrote that they had known. On the 30th day, the compliance force arrived at Senate Reach. It came in the way those fleets come in, which is slowly and from above, so that the station spends 40 minutes with something enormous crossing its sky. Work stopped on all 16 arms. People came out onto the observation galleries with their sandwiches. 4 heavy cruisers took station in a diamond over the wheel. The escorts fanned. The auxiliaries hung back, which was noted by every fitter watching, because auxiliaries hanging back means auxiliaries that cannot maneuver freely. And every fitter on that station knew exactly why. Nobody cheered. Nobody threw anything. A shuttle came down to Dock 6. The clerk came aboard first. That is not a joke. The custody officer was a small, precise man named Led with a case and a stamp, and he had a form, and the form had boxes. He walked into Vask Fitting and Salvage at 1400 station time and asked to record the yard's assets. Neri Vask gave him tea because her mother had raised her, and then she walked him around. 2 pressure bays, 1 gantry, motor faulty, repair deferred, 4 employees. He recorded 3 of them under hull service auxiliary and 1 under apprentice. He asked about Bay 2. She said 1 hull, 306 meters, registered bulk tender, conversion pending. He looked at his form. His form had a box for vessels under construction and a box for vessels in service. It did not have a box for 1 enormous dead thing that had been sitting in a repair bay since before he was born. He wrote it in the margin. He asked if it was operable. Neri Vask said it turned over. On the 32nd day, the heavy cruiser Vorn lost reactor feed pressure. The proprietary bulk fitting on her port feed had been assembled by a yard crew 4 years earlier and never opened since, and it did not fail because of anything anybody had done in the last month. It failed because seals age. The engineering compartment vented. 31 people died. The Vorn went dark, and 52,000 tons of unpowered cruiser began a slow, patient, entirely non-negotiable drift toward the northern rock field at 4 meters per second. Carr had 11 hours. He had tugs. The heaviest tug in the compliance force was rated for 8,000 tons of towed mass. He had 4 of them. 4 times 8 is 32,000. The Vorn massed 52,000. He ordered them out anyway, because you do. The station heard the distress call the way everyone hears distress calls, which is on the open channel in a flat voice with the numbers in it. Neri Vask was in the office. Gus Meade was in Bay 2. Kip Dorr came running down the arms shouting something nobody could hear over the alarm. Neri got Ellie Ward on the relay in 90 seconds and said 1 sentence. She said, "We have a keel rated for 58,000 tons sitting in my bay." There was a silence on the line about 3 seconds long. Ellie Ward said, "Is it fueled?" Neri said, "Ask him." Gus Meade came on. He said she had been fueled for 8 years. He said he had cycled her plant every 90 days since he got here, on his own time, on his own money, because he could not stand the sound of a cold plant. He said she would make turns in 40 minutes. Ellie Ward said, "Then not yet is over." Bay 2 doors opened at 19 minutes past the hour. The Ardent came out of Senate Reach stern first on 4 tugs, 306 meters of welded plate with visible seams and 43 years of patchwork paint, and every single person on the observation galleries went quiet at the same moment, because there is a shape a ship has when it is built to be a ship, and a different shape it has when it is built to survive being hit. And everybody in that gap had seen enough hulls to know the difference on sight. Her running lights came up in a pattern nobody recognized. Her plant came up. She turned. In the flag bridge of the cruiser Kesh, Marshal Ted Carr stood at the port and watched a bulk tender, conversion pending, rotate on its axis without tugs. He did not speak. Sub-Marshal Hesk brought up the optical. The optical showed the flank. It showed the plating along the dorsal spine, and it showed, under that plating, at intervals of exactly 22 meters, the raised circular rings where turret mounts had been fared over. 6 of them. Carr looked at the rings for a long moment. "I know what that is," he said. I did not know they had built one. Hesk asked whether it was armed. Carr said no. He said the mounts were empty and had been empty for decades, and that anyone could see it. Then he said the other thing, and he said it quietly, to nobody, and there were 6 words in it, and he would be asked to repeat them in inquiry rooms and interviews and one very uncomfortable dinner for the rest of his career, and he would repeat them every time without adding anything to them. We had them filed as suppliers. The Ardent took the Vorn under tow at 4 minutes past the hour, with 2 hours and 20 minutes of drift remaining. She did it the ugly way, bow to stern, on a hard line, because Gus Meade had built her to pull sections of unfinished hull between 3 moons, and her keel was the heaviest thing in the gap. Carr, watching, gave the order to recall his own tugs, which by then were already fouling the tow line, and the order reached them 4 minutes after the human tendermaster had told them to clear off in language the recording made no attempt to soften. On the 35th day, Marshal Ted Carr did the thing that ascendancy marshals almost never do, which is ask for an assessment he had not already decided the shape of. He asked for it in front of the whole staff so that nobody could soften it on the way. He said, "Tell me the honest number." The officer who delivered it was a supply auditor named Cyril, who had been trained to deliver bad news in a measured tone, and did, standing at the end of the table with a slate she did not look at, because she had it. 28 of 34 hulls could not conduct independent transfer. 63 dead across 3 events. Consumables at 7 days at current rationing. Water at 3 days for the 4 heavies, unless a transfer went through in the next 36 hours. 6,920 crew, of whom 2,200 were currently on half water. She got to the end and stopped. Nobody spoke. Cyril added one more line, unprompted, which is what got her promoted eventually. She said the fleet had not been stopped. She said it had been slowed to the speed of its own paperwork by people who did every single thing they were asked. Options were laid out and rejected one by one, and this took 2 hours because each one had to die properly. Seize the depots. There are 8. They are spread over 11 days of transit, and a seized depot produces nothing. Because a depot is not a warehouse. It is 100 people who know what fits what. Compel certification. Nobody in the compliance force held the qualification, because for 280 years, there had been no reason to hold a qualification for a part that arrived free with a card on it. Withdrawal. Withdrawal is a transfer problem, and the transfer problem is the problem. Fight. There was nothing to fight. Nobody had fired anything. Nobody had refused anything. There was no enemy in the gap. There was a service counter with a long line. At the end of it, Submarshal Hesk pulled the human registry entry onto the main display, because Carr asked him to, and there, under the original 280-year-old survey, were 14 lines entered on the 6th day by an auditor on OSIT that nobody had ever read. Carr read the last one out loud. The schedule describes how we met them. It does not describe what they are. He asked who Rill Vane was. Hesk said, a registry auditor. Carr asked what had happened to the request. Hesk said it was approved. Carr said then why had there been no survey, and Hesk read out the conditions. And the room listened to a man read out a set of requirements that added up to 46 days inside a window of 24, and something happened to the temperature in that compartment that nobody wrote down. On the 37th day, before any of this could be turned into an instruction, a frigate captain named Sella took a boarding party onto a human tender at the outer marker without authorization, on the theory that if the fittings were aboard, the fittings could simply be taken. He was correct that the fittings were aboard. He took 400 collars. What he did not take, because it could not be put in a hold, was the qualification to certify them. And the tender crew, being professionals, logged the removal, issued a receipt, and stood down every fitter in the corridor pending a safety review, which is exactly what the standard requires when parts leave a chain of custody. Transfers stopped completely for 20 hours. 2 more compartments went to emergency water. Carr removed Sella within the hour and sent him home on an auxiliary. Sella read the reprimand many times on that trip and concluded from it, wrongly and permanently, that he had been the only officer in the gap willing to act. On the 38th day, Marshal Ted Carr sent a message to the Human Depot Consortium. It was 13 words long, and he wrote it himself, and it read as follows. Request a meeting to discuss arrangements. Any location, any terms of access. Carr. The arbitration room on Senate Reach has bad chairs, a table with a repaired leg, and that stain outside the door. On the 40th day, it held 6 people. Ellie Ward came in with her mechanical pencil and a folder. Carr came in with Hesk and Cyril. Neri Vask was there because it was her station and her dock, and because Ellie Ward had asked for her by name. Gus Meade was not there. Gus Meade was 3 levels down replacing a bad seal on the station's number 2 water pump because it had started weeping on the 39th day and nobody else had the time. Ellie Ward opened by conceding, cheerfully, 4 things. Berthing fees for the compliance force, waived. Priority at every depot in the gap ahead of commercial traffic until the fleet was whole, which meant human carriers eating the delay. Fuel and consumables at cost, audited, no surcharge, with the books open. And no claim of any kind for the Sella affair, which she called a misunderstanding about paperwork, in a tone that made Cyril look at the table. Carr, who had come expecting to be flayed, found himself 20 minutes in, having been given almost everything, and understood, being an intelligent man, that he was about to be told the price. Ellie Ward turned the folder around. There was one item in it. It asked for reclassification. Removal of the human polity from provisioning and hull services, and a full physical resurvey conducted within 3 years, with the surveying auditor named in the agreement and the finding entered in the registry as a correction of the original entry rather than an amendment to it. Carr read it. Then he read the name in the auditor line, which was Real Vain, and something in his face moved. He asked for the room. Aides out, recorder off. 2 people. That conversation has never been published, but both of them described it afterward in almost identical terms, which is rare enough to be worth trusting. Carr said he could get her tonnage. He said he could get her a tariff position, guaranteed carriage, a compensation figure with 2 million credits in front of it, and no questions about how it was distributed, and he could get all of it signed inside a week. He said the reclassification would take 3 years, would embarrass 11 separate offices, and would give her nothing she could spend. He asked why she wanted it. Ellie Ward said that in 11 months, the last person who had watched a cruiser get towed by a scrap hull would be reassigned, and in 6 years the marshal would be retired, and in 20 years everyone in the room would be a name in a footnote. She said money gets spent, tariffs get renegotiated, and reputations decay at a rate you can almost graph. She said a category does not. She said a category sits in a drawer and gets consulted by people who never met anyone involved, and it tells them what kind of thing they are dealing with before they look, and they believe it because it is in the drawer. She said 63 of his people were dead because of a line written by a clerk who saw one ship with groceries in it 280 years ago and made a reasonable guess. Then she said the only sentence in this entire business that anyone bothered to carve anywhere. Categories outlive fleets, she said. Carr sat with that. He asked one more question, and it was not a negotiating question. He asked whether the old man in the yard was the one from the plate. She said his name was Gus Meade, and that he was paid 15 credits a day and had been for 8 years, and that this was her fault and she would be fixing it. Carr asked what he was doing right now. Neri Vask, called back in for exactly this, said he was on the number 2 water pump. Carr said he would like to meet him. Neri said he would not come up because the pump was open and you do not leave a pump open. On the 44th day, the agreement was signed in that same room, on paper, because Ellie Ward insisted on paper. Carr signed first. Ellie Ward signed second, and then handed the pencil to Neri Vask and asked her to witness it, which was not required by anything, and which Neri Vask has never once been able to explain without stopping in the middle. The ripple went out faster than the news did, because money moves faster than news. Within 4 months, the Marin Combine, which had been quietly pricing a move on the outer worlds for a decade, withdrew its survey teams and opened a trade office instead. And its analysts wrote a paper that circulated widely and was titled in translation, "On Reading Supply Registers Before Making Plans." The Osset yards began paying certification bonuses to any fitter who could hold the M-pattern qualification, and the going rate for a human fitter in the gap went from 15 credits a day to 94 inside a year, which Neri Vask paid without waiting to be asked, and which put her back into debt for another 4 years, and which she has described as the best money she ever spent. The Sector Insurance Board reclassified transit through the Corin Gap as low risk, on the grounds that the tenders were there. 208 small, ugly ships, sitting on markers with their deck lights on, changed the price of everything moving through that lane, and not one of them ever fired at anything, and not one of their masters was ever named in a single account of what happened. Rill Vane got her survey. She was notified on the 52nd day by a message that contained no apology and no acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong, because institutions do not do that either. It took her 3 years and 2 months. She visited 46 human worlds and stations, which is a number she noticed and never mentioned to anyone. The finding ran to 800 pages, and it corrected the original entry rather than amending it, which was the whole point and which cost more argument than the rest of the document combined. She was told, by a deputy she had never met, that she had been right all along. She said that being right about a bad thing is not the same as winning. She said 63 people were dead, and her being correct in a vault on Osset had not moved one of them out of the way. Then she asked for the next file. Tam Ochoa was called before a joint review the following spring and offered the opportunity to explain, on the record, his decision on the 16th day. He was told it would be entered as testimony and that it mattered. He said there was nothing to explain, that a collar is either tested or it is not, and that he had not done anything. He declined to say more. He went back to Depot 4 and worked another 18 years, and never once, in the whole of that time, brought it up. There is a kind of person who does the small, correct thing and then is genuinely puzzled to be asked about it later. 2 years after the signing, a historian named Ines Rahal came out to Senate Reach to write about the sector's supply system, which is a subject nobody wanted, and found herself sitting in a small warm quarters on the inner ring with a cup of tea and a man who was 77 and had a note stuck to his cold box with a magnet shaped like a fish. The note said, in handwriting, "Milk," and under that, "Ask Kip about the ballast pump." There was a drawer beside his chair. In the drawer was a washer, cast, 2 centimeters across, with a shop number stamped into it. She asked what it was. He said it came off the first section they ever set, from a shop on the second moon that made grain silos, and that it was the first part anybody outside a shipyard had ever made for a warship. He said he had put it in his pocket and forgotten to take it out. She asked the question she had come to ask. She asked what single decision changed everything. He thought about it for a while, and outside the port there was ordinary traffic, small tugs moving the way they always move. He said he had not decided anything. He said a fleet arrived, a cruiser broke, and a hull that was already there did the thing it was built to do. She pushed. She asked about the 105 days, and the 14 shops, and the fitting he had published for free that ended up on 30 out of 34 enemy hulls. Gus Meade said the fitting was not clever, it was just numbered, and that any fool who has ever tried to find a left-hand seal at 2 in the morning would have done the same. Then he gave her the line she used, and it is the only line of his in the whole 800-page survey. He said a ship is not a thing. He said a ship is a list of parts and a way to get them, and that everyone who ever lost a war knew that afterward. Ines Rahal wrote it down. Then she asked why he had kept the Ardence plant cycled for 8 years at his own expense on 15 credits a day, and he looked at her like she had asked why he breathed. And he said, "You do not let a plant go cold." She stayed another hour. Neri Vask came by at the end of it with 2 cups of the brown, which was still not coffee, and the 3 of them sat there and talked about the gantry motor, which was still broken because the parts had been on order for 2 years and the yard was busy now. Gus Meade died the following winter, at 78, in his chair, in the afternoon, with a cup of tea going cold on the arm of it, and the fish magnet still holding up the note about milk. There was no ceremony beyond the ordinary one. The consortium offered to name a depot after him and Ellie Ward, who was 70 by then, and who had known him for 40 years, said he would have found that embarrassing. And instead, the 8 depots put his shop number on their certification cards, small, in the corner, where only a fitter would look. Nobody celebrated any of it. Not the tow, not the signing, not the correction of the entry. There was nothing to celebrate. 63 people were dead in a corridor of clean space over a fitting. 2 families on the Vorn never got remains because the compartment vented. Rill Vane lost 3 years and 2 months of her life to a document that nobody outside the registry will ever open. Neri Vask carried a debt into her 50s for the sin of having once been broke enough to buy a man's sheep, and she has never described it as anything but that. Marshal Ted Carr retired 4 years early and answered the same question at the same dinners until he stopped attending dinners. Nothing was won. Something was corrected, which is a smaller and more durable thing. 6 weeks after the funeral, the number 2 water pump on the inner ring started weeping again at the same seal, in the same place, for the same reason, because that is what number 2 does. Kip Dorr took the call. He was 25 by then, and he held the M pattern qualification, and he had held it for 3 years, having sat the examination in a rented hall on Bracken with 40 other apprentices, and passed it on the first attempt, which Gus Meade had said nothing at all about at the time and had mentioned twice a year afterward to strangers. He went down with a kit and a light. He shut the isolation valves. He drained the housing into a bucket because the drain line had never been finished and there was no reason to finish it now. He pulled the old seal, which came out in 2 pieces, and smelled the way old seals smell. He cleaned the face with a scraper and then with his thumb, because you can feel a burr you cannot see, and Gus Meade had made him do that for a year before letting him touch anything under pressure. He fitted the new seal. He torqued the collar in the star pattern, a quarter turn at a time, 4 passes. He opened the valves. He brought it up to working pressure and held it there for 50 minutes with a gauge and a rag and nothing to do, which is the part of the trade nobody puts in the recruiting material. It held. In his pocket, because Neri Vask had given it to him out of the drawer and told him it was not a keepsake, it was a tool for reminding him of something. There was a cast washer 2 centimeters across with a shop number stamped in it. He did not take it out. He wiped the housing down. He filled in the card the way it is filled in, with the date, the part, the pressure held, the duration, and the result. And he signed it in the box at the bottom, and he hung it on the wire beside the pump with the other 400 cards going back 30 years, one of them in handwriting he recognized. In the space for remarks, he wrote the 2 words the old man always wrote there, which were not a motto to Gus Meade, only a description of the job. Parts, not miracles. They had come to seize a repair yard. They went home in hulls built by people the file said could not build.